He only bandaged an injured elder on the side of a desert road. But that single act put an entire station on the edge of collapse. Sheriff Connor saw it not as mercy, but as a dangerous weakness, and was ready to answer it with force. But Thomas Gray chose compassion over fear, never expecting that choice to hold back 450 warriors from the brink of war. And just wait until you see how this quiet rebellion turned into a stunning moment of justice. The sun beat down on the New Mexico desert like a silent judge. Dust curled in the air behind the westbound stagecoach as its wheels groaned under heat and time. Every creak of wood and jolt of the trail echoed the tension of the men guarding it, each of them trained to expect trouble long before it showed its face. Thomas Gray rode shotgun, literally. A former Army medic turned stagecoach guard. He had the kind of silence about him that made others hesitate to ask too many questions. He wasn't a talker. He watched. He listened. And when he acted, it was fast and final. The passengers behind him were settlers, traders, and one preacher with a worn Bible in his lap. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing now and then at the rifle across Thomas's knees. Then came the moment. It wasn't much at first. A shape near the edge of the canyon pass, low to the ground, unmoving. Most would have ridden past it, assuming it was just another carcass left behind by buzzards or coyotes. But Thomas didn't. He signaled the driver to slow. Wheels ground against gravel. A cloud of sand lifted as the coach came to a halt. The passengers leaned to see what the delay was, irritation flickering behind their eyes. Thomas stepped down without a word. His boots crunched against the dry earth. As he approached the figure, he could make out the markings on the blanket, the worn beadwork along the edge. It was a Kiowa elder. The man's chest rose and fell shallowly. His left side was bruised, lips cracked from thirst. He had collapsed under the punishing sun, miles from shelter. Still, there was no panic in his eyes, only calm and pain. Thomas knelt beside him, brushed off the flies, and reached for the leather pouch at his belt. Inside were the same supplies he had carried since the war. Salve, cloth, a flask of water. He poured a bit of water onto the cloth and gently pressed it to the man's forehead. No one spoke. From behind, someone muttered, "You're wasting time." Another added, "He might be scouting for a raid." Thomas didn't answer. He cut away part of the elder's torn sleeve, cleaned the gash on his shoulder, and wrapped it with bandages that had been meant for travelers or riders. But in that moment, he decided the man in front of him needed them more. The elder's lips moved, barely a whisper. "You saw me," he said. Thomas met his eyes. There was no fear, only recognition. He helped him sit against a shaded rock and left a small canteen within reach before standing again. The others watched him return to the coach, not hiding their unease. Some glanced to the horizon, half expecting riders to come storming from the cliffs. As the stagecoach pulled away, Thomas looked back once. The man hadn't moved, but his eyes were open, watching, remembering. In the coach, silence hung like smoke. No one thanked him, no one spoke. But Thomas knew something had shifted. A simple act, unremarkable to some, had stirred a line that most would never cross. And out there, beyond the rocks and sky, someone had seen it. By nightfall, the wind had changed. The heat that had once pressed against the earth had given way to something colder, not in temperature, but in presence. A kind of stillness that didn't belong in the desert, the kind that made coyotes go quiet and horses restless in their stalls. Hope Creek Station stood on flat land, surrounded by open range and jagged hills in the distance. It had seen its share of trouble over the years. Bandits, storms, travelers arriving with stories soaked in fear. But nothing quite like this. It started with the smoke. One column at first, thin and distant, rising past the northern ridge like a ghost finger pointing to the sky. Then another, to the west. Then three more in a scattered arc. Within the hour, there were dozens. Soon after, hundreds. By midnight, the entire station was ringed by firelight, flickering from the low-burning campfires of surrounding tents. Someone counted, 450. That number spread through the station faster than the wind. Some whispered it. Others refused to say it out loud, as if doing so might make it more real. Inside the walls, panic stirred like dust in a drought. The stable hands checked the locks twice. The women herded the younger ones into the cellar. Even the preacher's prayers grew quieter, as though louder words might draw attention. Thomas stood at the main gate, watching the fires, his face unreadable. He hadn't said a word since they arrived. No one knew if the man they'd left behind had survived, but someone out there had seen what happened. That much was certain now. One of the station boys tried to sound confident. They wouldn't attack at night. Not with all of us ready. But his voice shook on the last word. From the watchtower, a lookout whispered what many feared. They're not hiding. They want us to see them. And it was true. The fires weren't for warmth. They were symbols, signals. The placement wasn't random. It was precise, methodical. A quiet warning that didn't need a single shout to be understood. Thomas paced the perimeter once, then again. He glanced toward the hills, then to the faces of those behind the walls. Fear made their expressions sharp. Distrust made them sharper. Some of the townsfolk looked at him now with the same suspicion they once saved for strangers, as if helping a wounded man had brought this down on them. A rider approached from the east road, a scout returning early. "No movement," he said, breathless. "Just fires. Tents, drums." That was the first anyone had mentioned the sound. Faint, almost like a heartbeat rising from different points beyond the ridge. A steady rhythm, slow and patient, as if time itself was tapping its fingers. Inside the main house, the station manager gathered the guards. "If they come for us, we don't wait. We don't negotiate. We protect what's ours." But Thomas said nothing. His hands rested on his belt, not near his weapon. His eyes didn't blink. He had been through this before. Not here, not now. But something close. And it always began the same way. Not with shouts, not with warnings, but with waiting. Someone touched his shoulder. It was a young worker, barely 16. "Did you know he was one of theirs?" Thomas looked at the boy. "No. But I knew he was a man." The boy didn't know how to respond. He just nodded and walked away. Outside, the fires burned steady. The hills glowed orange, and above it all, the stars disappeared behind a layer of unseen smoke. The night was long, but no one slept. At first light, the desert held its breath. The fires were still burning, low and steady, their smoke drifting in thin trails above the station. No war cries, no charge. Just the same stillness that had ruled the night, stretched now into the cold light of dawn. Then a figure appeared on the eastern ridge, tall, composed, wrapped in layers of cloth and leather, painted with symbols that shimmered faintly in the rising sun. He walked alone, but with intention, not a step wasted. Behind him, a boy followed, barefoot in the dust, carrying something white. The guards at the station wall raised their rifles. Orders were shouted, positions taken. The tension that had built through the night snapped into motion, but no one fired, not yet. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the small piece of cloth in the boy's hands. He recognized it instantly. It was the bandage, the one he had torn from his own kit to wrap the elder's wound. The Kiowa warrior stopped within clear view of the station gate. He raised both hands, not in surrender, not in fear, but with calm dignity. The boy stepped beside him, lifted the folded cloth and held it high above his head. A symbol, not of threat, but of memory. Thomas descended the steps and walked out alone, slow but steady, toward the open space between the walls and the visitor. His movements were deliberate, offering neither challenge nor retreat. They met in the middle. The Kiowa man spoke first, his voice low but clear. "My father breathes because of you." Thomas didn't reply right away. The wind stirred his coat. Behind him, rifles clicked into place. "I did what needed doing," he said at last. The man studied him. "You saw him as a man, not as an enemy. That is remembered." The boy approached, handed Thomas the folded bandage. It was clean, pressed, preserved. Then, the Kiowa warrior turned slightly and raised his arm. A signal. From the hills, riders appeared, not charging, not armed for battle, but moving with solemn precision. They rode in silence, forming a wide circle near the edge of the fire line. Among them, carried carefully on a stretcher, was the elder, awake, watching. Gasps rose from the station wall. No one moved. The elder lifted a hand, not to curse, not to accuse, but to greet. It was an open hand, a hand of peace. The Kiowa rider spoke again, quieter now. "My people do not forget wounds, but we remember those who mend them." Thomas looked to the hills, to the station behind him, to the bandage in his hand. Something shifted in that moment. Not loudly, but deeply. The kind of change that doesn't come with banners or speeches, but with a single decision made at the right time. For no reward, with no witness. When he turned and walked back toward the station, the silence followed him. Not heavy, but full. Full of things unspoken. And for the first time since the fires were lit, the people inside the walls lowered their weapons. The council was held in the long hall of the station house, where meals were usually served and freight records kept. Now, the benches were pushed aside. The table, cleared of lanterns and ledgers, stood bare between two sides that had only just started seeing one another without weapons in hand. On one side sat Thomas Gray and Sheriff George Connor, a man built like the land he policed. Dry, rigid, and hard to read. Alongside them were two local elders and the head of the station. Across from them stood Sloan, the Kiowa leader, and two men who had arrived on horseback just before sunrise. Their faces bore the marks of their nation, but their posture, their silence, spoke of discipline and patience. They did not raise voices. They did not reach for their blades. They simply waited for the air to clear. Sheriff Connor was the first to speak. "You brought nearly 500 to our gates. That's no peaceful gesture." Sloan answered without flinching. "We brought what you brought to us many times before. Presents, but not fire." The tension in the room thickened. Thomas watched them both. He said nothing yet. His hands were folded on the table, and his eyes drifted occasionally to the window, where the elder still rested under watch near the horses, breathing shallow but steady. The sheriff leaned forward. "You expect us to believe this was all for show?" "No," Sloan said. "I expect you to understand it was not a threat. It was remembrance. My father bled in your dust, but he was lifted by your man. So we came to see what kind of place breeds someone who chooses to heal." There was a silence, not empty, but full of meaning. The station manager cleared his throat, unsure if he should speak. He didn't. Connor shook his head slightly. "All this just to tell us we were lucky?" Sloan's voice was even. "You were watched, judged. The fires were not lit in anger, they were lit in witness." That was when Thomas spoke. "You don't trust us," he said plainly. Sloan looked at him, and there was a flicker of something, respect perhaps. Trust is not born in words. It grows in actions, like seeds in dry soil, slow or not at all. Thomas nodded slightly. "The boy, the cloth. That meant something." "It meant everything," Sloan said. The sheriff wasn't convinced. His jaw tightened, his hand inching toward the edge of the table. "I don't care for symbols," he muttered. "Then you'll never know what stopped this from turning into smoke and ash," came the quiet reply. Again, silence. It lingered longer this time. The riders behind Sloan remained still, like statues carved from the desert itself. They had no need to raise voices or carry banners. Their leader had spoken, and they trusted his words. Outside, the station's people waited. Some by doors, some on rooftops, still watching the horizon. The fires beyond the hills had begun to dim. Inside, Sheriff Connor finally stood. "If we let this stand, word will spread that we backed down." Thomas looked at him. "Or that we stood up for something more important than pride." Connor didn't answer. He walked toward the door and paused there, his shadow cast long across the floor. "You talk to fire like it listens," he said over his shoulder. "But not every fire wants to be understood." Sloan met his gaze. "That's why most men burn." He turned, walked back to the open air, and left the council room behind. No hands were shaken, no treaties signed. But something had shifted, again. A quiet accord, carved not in stone, but in memory. And outside, for the first time in 2 nights, one of the campfires went out. Days passed, then weeks. The fires on the hills faded one by one, not with haste, but with intention. By the end of the 2nd week, the ridge stood quiet again. Only wind moved through the brush. The Kiowa had left no trace of conflict, no weapons, no markings, just silence, and a folded cloth resting on the stone near the front gate. Clean, white, set there like a memory, not a message. Thomas found it at dawn. He stood looking at it for a long time before picking it up. No words were needed. Life at Hope Creek Station resumed. Wagons came and went. Letters were delivered. Trade continued. But something had changed. Subtle, not spoken aloud, but felt in the way people paused before they judged, or watched the horizon with a little more thought. Sheriff Connor resigned before the month was out, said little when he left. Just packed his things and rode east without ceremony. His absence, like his presence, left behind a certain weight. Thomas stayed. He repaired the fence by the north trail, rebuilt the storage shed near the well. And when the next caravan arrived with a rider limping from a fall, it was Thomas who wrapped the bandage, same as always. Inside the main station house, above the desk where cargo logs were kept, the white cloth now hung framed behind glass. It bore no name, no inscription. It didn't need one. Most who saw it didn't ask. But a few who understood nodded quietly, as if seeing something they hadn't known they missed. And sometimes in the evening, when the sun lowered across the hills just right, a faint shimmer on the horizon would flicker like firelight, too distant to be certain, too familiar to ignore. Not a warning, just remembrance.